Forensic scientists, what is the most what the F case that you have ever had? A friend of mine is a CSI, and I don't know if he's posted here, but just in case he hasn't, I'll put this here. Anchorage, Alaska, 2008. A 27-year-old woman hasn't paid her rent in 4 months. The landlord gave her a bit of a reprieve because he knew she was very poor and she was in low-income housing. But after 4 months of zero contact, enough is enough, and he calls the cops to get into her place and either see her to talk or change the locks and remove her stuff to a storage shed so the apartment can be released to someone else. The cops find the front door to be bolted and use the landlord's key to get in, then find the woman dead in her shower, just sort of slumped as if she fell against the wall and slid down. The water wasn't on, and as this is Alaska in the winter, the water is never shut off by the city because if hot water isn't moving through the pipes, they freeze and burst. The fact that the shower's off means she never turned it on or someone turned it off. The body is taken to the morgue and autopsied at the family's request because no obvious means of death can be found. As far as the examination could conclude, she died from an adrenal surge causing her heart to stop, more commonly known as frightened to death, which, yes, can actually happen in some rare cases. The body was old, but no test showed any residual drugs in her system. None were found in the apartment, nor was any sign of anyone having entered or left before the cops. The young, pretty average health woman appears to have gotten into her shower and then her heart stopped due to terror. As far as I know, that's where the story ends. No substantial leads. If that isn't the start to a horror movie, I don't know what is. Set this during those Alaskan winters where there's hardly any sunlight, and you've got the setup for a truly scary flick. A friend of mine is a forensic scientist, and her department dealt with burglary cases only, usually generating pretty uninteresting stuff to tell people. But her only good story is that once she got a pair of gloves found at the crime scene, she went to examine them and felt that there was something hard inside. She turned the glove up to get it out, and out falls a thumb ripped off at the first joint. Apparently, this particular burglar was holding up a safe with his mate when underneath it, dropped the safe on his hands, ripped his hands out, and ran. They obviously caught the guy. You really missed the opportunity to say that they caught the guy red-handed. Who's got 2 thumbs and tried to rob a safe? Not that guy. A friend is a psychologist whose previous life was in crime scene photography. She went to the scene of a self-termination in a garage. The guy had a project car that he had worked on his whole life. When he decided to end it all, he wanted to go with the car, so he shut the garage and turned on the engine and waited. To top it off, he had taken a bunch of pain and sleeping pills. When my friend got there, it was a good while after his death. EMTs and other specialists were looking for details and whatnot. He was the VP of a fairly large chain of local businesses, so there was an insurance settlement to consider. My friend is in the middle of photographing the scene, and the guy was laying there, pronounced dead hours ago, and he suddenly just shook hard. She thought it was a death rattle, so she kept taking pictures. Eventually, the guy sat up and nodded, and the EMTs were called back in to stabilize him and eventually save him. Apparently, the car had run out of gas right at the moment he went out, and he was pronounced dead on the scene. He couldn't talk or do much, but he had actually survived. Forensic chemist here, who occasionally gets called out to crime scenes just to consult on evidence collection. On the first one I ever went on, a father had shot his adult son and put the body in a deep freeze that was in his bedroom. There were a ton of cops and other people from our lab there, but when the coroner asked for help removing the body from the freezer, I volunteered quickly, as I had never been that close to a dead body, other than funerals, and was curious. As I helped the coroner lift the body out of the freezer, which still had a bunch of food in it too, a pack of frozen biscuits was stuck to his body. I had to pry them off him, which was both very weird and kind of funny at the same time. I interned at the office of the chief medical examiner when I was 18. Saw a lot of interesting stuff, learned a lot of interesting things. One case stuck with me more than the rest. I arrived one morning, went down to the basement where bodies were laid out for rounds every morning. On tables lay the usual, a couple folks who died in a hospital and needed a partial autopsy to sign off on a death certificate, a drug overdose, a drug murder. Then on one table, there was a blue Tupperware bin, a big one, about 3 foot by 3 foot by 2 foot. It was filled with concrete, and out of the edges a little plastic wrap was lining between the concrete and the bin, and then out of the top of the concrete a couple toes were poking out. The The story was, out in the country, a family saw a small fire in the woods outside of their house, called the fire department, and after putting out the flames, they found this bin. When we cracked the bin open, we found half of a man, about from the belly button down. Someone had thought the best way to dispose of this body would be to cut it in half, wrap it in plastic, put it in a Tupperware bin, fill the bin with concrete, and set it on fire. What they had really done was essentially cook the body in an oven with the plastic wrap acting as a roasting bag. Skin was sloughing off the legs and feet, and the skin was discolored by this time, a nice green. Though this was about 10 years ago, I distinctly remember still being able to make out saw marks on the top edge of this half, however. Notes were taken, and no sign of death were found on the legs, and no indications of the person's identity either. Unfortunately, my internship ended a few weeks before they found the top half, so I never got to learn more about the case, but the image still certainly sticks with me till now. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the mind of the murderer. Like, okay, I'll just cut him up. Oh, this is taking too long. Let me wrap the pieces up. Maybe I'll just seal it in concrete. Crap, what do I do with these huge blocks of concrete? Does concrete burn? Man about 40 years old kills wife and children with an army rifle, old model, CA 3000 joules muzzle energy. Puts the muzzle under the chin and fires. The bullet takes half the face away. Blood drops lead to bathroom, in front of the mirror, then to the ammo box, and finally to the place of the second and last shot to the head. And a case of someone found dead from a gunshot wound to the heart on a bridge without any weapon, bullet, or cartridge case. Circumstantial evidence finally indicated a self-termination, but we still don't know how he got the weapon to float away. The bottom of the river was searched, and nothing was found except the tools of the bridge builders. Worked at an ME's for a bit, had a couple pass away from a two-person plane crash. When the autopsy began, it smelled a bit like burnt barbecue, and the people in the body bags weren't in your typical dead, lying flat position. They were kind of stuck in a fetal position-ish. Opened up the bag, and I saw weird bumps on each of their heads. Asked the ME what was up with the bumps. I guess at high temps, the brain expands and needs somewhere to go. At some point, it just kind of pops out of the skull. So their brains were some inside, some outside of the skull. Then we try examining the body, and it looks like a cheap prop from a movie. I notice a wedding band on the female passenger and try my best to remove it. The whole finger comes off with it. Felt kind of bad. Then I spent 10 minutes trying to clean off what I can only imagine was human grease and burnt flesh off the ring so we could package it up and eventually return it to the family. Plane crashes are pretty crazy. I regularly post on Unsolved Mysteries, so I thought this was fitting here. One of the best cases on Forensic Files was Cold Case that had gone unsolved for decades. A man told police he had picked up a hitchhiker in the evening. After the man and the hitchhiker got into a fight, the man threw him out of his car 2 miles away from his mother's house on a busy highway. The man later came home to his mother's house only to find the hitchhiker at his mother's house. He left to go call the police from a payphone. This was before cell phones. The police found his mother dead in bed. The man was a beneficiary of a huge life insurance policy and was the prime suspect. The cops or anyone did not believe the man's story. It was inconceivable that the hitchhiker, who did not know where the mother's house was, could make a 2-mile journey with turns in a neighborhood to just randomly break in and kill the man's mother, who he didn't know. But there was blood at the scene and a palm print on the staircase that was not the man's nor the mother's. After some investigation, people at Hardee's did confirm that there was a man that fit the description looking to hitchhike. Still, they just assumed the man had paid the other man to kill his mother. 15 years later, after the invention of CODIS, the DNA was matched to a career criminal who definitely matched the description of the hitchhiker. After bringing him in and interrogating him, the killer had no idea he had killed the mother of the man who gave him a ride. He simply walked through this neighborhood looking for a house that looked empty, and his mother's was the only one without the lights on. It's baffling. While you should never just assume in wild coincidences when it comes to crimes like this, every once in a while, wild coincidences are exactly what happen. I was at a regional medical center in rural Guatemala when we had a case come in from an RTA, road traffic accident, involving a pedestrian and a chicken bus. For those of you who don't know, a popular but incredibly dangerous form of public transport are retired American school buses that have been painted all sorts of vibrant colors, but underneath, the mechanics are shot to crap. Anyway, this pedestrian had been hit by one of these rolling death traps, which was fully loaded, going around 80 miles per hour, and ended up getting wrapped under the right front wheel arch and completely mangled beyond recognition. They found bits of this guy spread 2 kilometers down the road as the initial impact had split his torso down the middle and basically turned him inside out. When all the bits had been collected, the height of the body bag was around 2 inches, so you imagine the state of the remains. Passers-by helped us pick up bits from the side of the road, but dogs and cats ran off with a fair amount of the smaller bits. Guatemala is a cool place. I majored in anthropology with a focus on forensic anthropology. Given that, I was a fairly regular reader of the Forensic Science Quarterly. Here are a couple that I remember. Kid found on top of an elevator in a 6-story dorm. Apparently he was elevator surfing, which is just as dumb as it sounds. He somehow got his head caught in the cables and got it twisted around a couple of times. This did not immediately kill him. He died from asphyxiation. This means he had anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple of minutes to contemplate what had happened to him before he lost consciousness. Another one was sort of a mystery case. Headless corpse found in a truck in a national park. No head was to be found in the immediate area. Truck was turned on but had run out of gas. The wound was very clean, no sawing, almost like a guillotine cut. The investigation authorities were rather confused, but eventually they found a receipt in his pocket for 50 yards of nylon rope. They widened the investigation and eventually found the rope tied to a tree with a noose at one end. Further searching of this area eventually turned up the head. Pretty unique method of self-termination. Mystery solved. This one isn't from the magazine, but a story personally related to me from the officer involved. A call comes in for a 50-ish black woman dead in a garage. Investigation reveals it is actually a 35-year-old white male. Dude put on a dress, rigged a noose to his garage door opener, and proceeded to watch some adult entertainment in his garage while choking himself with the garage door opener. Battery in the remote died, and then so did he. Another case that sticks in my memory is of a guy that decided to kill himself with a .30-06 and a .308. For you non-gun people, those are 2 very powerful calibers, literally overkill. Anyway, this guy manages to get 2 rifles under his chin and fire them at the same time while lying on his bed. This obliterates his head. I mean, like there was nothing left but a stump. That isn't why the case sticks with me, however. What happens next is that the local forensic departments decide to reconstruct the head as an exercise. They collect every piece except for the orbital sockets, which evaporated, and put them all back together. The result came out looking very much like the victim, although slightly bug-eyed. The before and after of that is something I don't think I'll ever forget. I know you have to get used to gruesome stuff to work in forensics, but I'm not sure I could ever get so used to gore that I would be willing to put together the world's worst 3D puzzle. I barely have patience for regular puzzles, let alone ones that are bloody. I have a professor who was an expert in osteology and would train radiologists and doctors to recognize defensive fractures in arm bones. Defending yourself from an attack can leave a very distinctive spiral fracture on your forearms, and in his years of research, he'd never encountered that specific fracture pattern anywhere except in a defensive wound. Until he was attending a seminar at the University of Toronto in February, and when leaving the lecture, he was walking down an outdoor flight of stairs when someone called out to him to ask a question. He had his hands in his pockets because he wasn't wearing gloves, turned, slipped, and fell while perpendicular to the steps. His forearm hit the step and resulted in the exact spiral fracture he'd never seen anywhere else, and best part is that the radiologist that examined him was someone he himself had trained to look for this sort of fracturing as a warning sign for domestic violence. Digital forensics case. Executive was using way more data than anyone else on his air card. The local IT guys took it to check it out for viruses and whatnot. Found loads of CP. Guy got brought up on charges, lost his job, family torn apart, the whole spiel. We do our analysis, found out there was a virus that was serving said pictures for a dark website. Only thing that got him off was the rate at which the data was accessed. He got fat restitution, but that won't put his life back together. Made me get out of the business because I thought this guy was guilty for sure, but we kept finding little hints that suggested it was something other than what we thought. Had we missed something, he would be in jail as we speak. Couldn't sleep with that kind of burden. I'm in third year as a forensic anthropology student, and I don't have my own cases yet, but I've studied hundreds and have been told about some. My professor in advanced forensic methods was one of the leads in a case of Anthony Hardy, who basically killed people, dismembered them, and put their body parts in bins that were eventually found by a homeless guy. Another she worked on, actually all I'm going to list were ones she was involved with, involved a man who went to park his car in the garage as he normally did, but his wife's car was in the spot. She refused to move it, so naturally, he stabbed her about 17 times, put her in his boot, and drove off. He explained the blood stains away as being animal blood of something he'd hit, carried home in his boot, and cut up in the garage floor. Obviously, this was a crap excuse, as simple blood testing showed it was human. She ran us through the forensics involved in that case, and it was quality crap. One was a man found with his wrist and throat slit sitting on the floor of his living room, depressed old man. Self-termination, right? Wrong. The cut to his throat stopped halfway across and was at an unusual angle, then stopping halfway through is a good sign of holding someone from behind, reaching around and slitting the throat. Stopping halfway in that position, it's much harder to fight a struggle. Also, the wrist wound had very little blood and was evidently done after the throat slit. The way he was sat showed that it was likely a loved one, as his body was taken care of, as strange as that sounds, and placed in a loving position. Possibly the weirdest one, a woman was found dead in the hall at the bottom of the stairs with blunt force trauma to the skull. There was a large hole in the ceiling above her, and the situation told to the forensic team by the police is that she fell through the loft. In the loft, no boxes were moved, and there were loads around the site of the hole. If she fell, she would have grabbed out, right? More damning, it was clear by some sawdust and the state of the slats that someone had used a saw to cut through the wood. Also, the blood splatter on the wall was all wrong. Basically, what had happened was that her husband had smashed her head in, put her at the bottom of the stairs, cut a hole in the loft, called the police, and told them of the accident. He also tried to kill the family liaison officer in the kitchen when the police were there after he realized the jig was up. Seen a lot more crap. Self-terminations that look like murders but no evidence found, vice versa. Bodies found in burnt-down buildings, bodies found in a swamp or more from years back. Crap meth labs, even got sort of taught how to make meth accidentally. Mass graves, photos of r/murder victims. It's pretty grim at times. And all of that right there is why I'll just stick to being the mainly guy and never get into forensics. I'm gonna have enough nightmares just reading about this stuff. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.